If y'all are not familiar with this man on the screen, this is Woodrow Wilson, of course, one of the American presidents. And one thing that's very interesting about his presidency is at the time of when he was president, which was right around the 1918 period, which was the time of the Spanish flu. And the reason I'm highlighting him today is because I came across this article where literally it came full circle. So as we all know, the Spanish flu was pretty devastating. Like took out millions of people globally. Like it did worse than what the woo-woo is doing right now. Not saying the woo-woo can't get to those numbers, but the Spanish flu is right now is reigning supreme in that category. So the reason why I'm talking about this today is, according to this article that I'm going to read, he had the same attitude that 45 has right now. And that's saying that the various pandemics are hoaxes. He downplayed it too, just like 45 did. But then he ended up catching the Spanish flu and fell violently ill to it. So ill, in fact, I think it almost killed him. Now look at what's happening with 45. The last thing I heard is that he had trouble breathing. And when I say he, I'm talking about 45. Of course, anything can change between now and the time of the upload of this video. But I'm going to go ahead and read this article and see what else we'll figure out. Even a U.S. president couldn't avoid a pandemic that swept the world and infected millions. The year 1919, the president Woodrow Wilson. The disease, dubbed the Spanish flu, emerged in 1918 during the last months of World War I. Initially, the Wilson administration tried to downplay the disease even as it spread worldwide. Presidential historian TV Troy, citing the administration's response to the pandemic, calls Wilson the worst U.S. president in terms of handling a disaster, which is ironically the title that they give 45 now. The federal response to the influenza outbreak in 1918 can be best described as neglectful. Hundreds of thousands of Americans died without President Wilson saying anything or mobilizing non-military components of the U.S. government to help the civilian population. Troy writes in the Shall We Wait the President, 2 centuries of disaster management from the Oval Office. He also blames Wilson for contributing to the pandemic by continuing the mobilization of troops even as World War I was winding down to a close. In April 1919, however, Wilson himself contracted the illness shortly after arriving in Paris for the Big Four peace talks. Sarah Fling, a fellow writing for the White House Historical Association, notes that a number of members of the Wilson entourage had caught the flu during a transatlantic voyage in February 1919, including his daughter, Margaret, several members of the Secret Service, Wilson's stenographer, and his chief usher. News of Wilson's illness was initially hidden from the public, with the Associated Press reporting flatly on April 5th that the president was not stricken with influenza. But no one knew better what was unfolding than Rear Admiral Cary T. Grayson, personal physician to the president. Publicly, Grayson said only that the president had caught a cold because of his workload and the chilly and rainy weather in Paris. Privately, however, Grayson told a different story. In a letter that only became public a little over a decade ago, he wrote to a friend on April 14th explaining, "These past 2 weeks have certainly been strenuous days for me. The president was suddenly taken violently sick with the influenza at a time when the whole of civilization seemed to be in the balance. And without him and his guidance, Europe would certainly have turned to Bolshevism and anarchy," he continued in the letter, now held by the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library. "From your side of the water, you cannot realize on what thin ice European civilization has been skating. I just wish you could spend a day with me behind the scenes here. Someday, perhaps, I may be able to tell the world what a close call we had." During the peace talks, Fling writes, the Big Four were trying to resolve larger questions of German reparations, the creation of the League of Nations, and the threat of Bolshevism, all of which were jeopardized by Wilson's sickness. Around that same time, a Washington Post columnist wrote, "The country will be anxious regarding President Wilson until he is again at work. It is a time when an hour lost means the loss of millions of hours to these individuals who are awaiting to begin reconstruction. The Allied world hopes, for the sake of its material interests, that his illness will be light and brief." As the president's illness progressed, aides became alarmed when the normally predictable Wilson began, on at least 2 occasions, blurting out unexpected orders, according to A. Scott Berg in his biography, Wilson. The president created a scene over pieces of furniture that had suddenly disappeared when in fact it had not been moved at all. At one point, Berg writes, Wilson was certain that he was surrounded by French spies. We could but surmise that something queer was happening in his mind. Chief Usher Irwin Hoover later recalled, according to John M. Barry, in The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. One thing was certain, he was never the same after this little spell of sickness. Barry writes that the flu undercut Wilson's stamina, disrupted his concentration, and affected his mind in deeper ways. 6 months after contracting the flu, Wilson suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and blind and effectively incapacitated as president. He died in 1924 in February, 3 years after leaving office. So, it's coming full circle. And as you can see, that Spanish flu crippled the hell out of Woodrow Wilson, even down to his brain capacity, where he was having these delusions that people were spying on him. Like that flu, like he was never the same after that. Now, fast forward almost 100 years, well, over 100 years later, and this happens. It's amazing. It's been 101 years since 102 because it started in 1918. It's been 102 years since the Spanish flu happened, and now we have this going on, and people want to downplay it like it's not real. And now look at what's going on with 45. He's going through roughly kind of the same thing that Woodrow Wilson is going through. And back then, they didn't even have all the technology that we have today. And you would think that we didn't have it today with the way and how fast this thing is moving. That's because it's so new to us. And even with the most advanced of technology, there's still a lot of precautions that have to be taken place. That's why you don't take anything and just brush it off as something else, when clearly it's something to be taken seriously. Don't treat it as something lightly. But I just thought it was interesting, and I wanted to come and do this video because he had the same attitude that 45 has right now. And now 45 is tiptoeing in the same position that Woodrow Wilson had. Like, you heard the symptoms that this guy was going through after he got it. He even got left partially paralyzed because of it. That's how intense it was. And the thing is, I don't know how old Woodrow Wilson was at the time of him getting the illness, but I'm only going to assume that he wasn't the same age as 45. I don't think he was in his 70s. And see, 45 is by health standards is obese. He has a piss poor diet. All of that stuff is unraveling right now. And there's nothing anybody can really do to try to shield it anymore. I mean, they get out there and they try to tell you one thing, but let's be real here. We're not dense. We're not dunce cap wearing buffoons. We know that his illness, mental or otherwise, is something that should be taken seriously by him, most certainly, but by his base. But you know, his base, they're so delusional too, because that's how he played them up to be. But we'll see how all of this plays out in due time.